today in Rich in Relationship. We're going to talk about,
we revealed the secret reason why you can't seem to stop fighting. And guess what? It's not completely on you. The hidden cost of living digitally is dissonance, of avoiding a fight and leading parallel lives. Studies suggest that couples who regularly disengage from each other in favor of technology are more likely to feel lonely, misunderstood, and eventually pursue separation. Welcome to another episode of Rich in Relationship. And today we're talking about how technology has hijacked our relationships. That's right, hijacked. And this isn't going to be your average, oh, stop scrolling on social media kind of pitch. I want you to really get the relationship between how we use screens and how we use our minds and what this is doing to our relationships. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever noticed how conflict with your partner, like once it gets started, just seems to escalate faster than maybe even than before, and there doesn't seem to be any real resolution? Well, the reason for that is our brain, which is broken up into different parts, has some parts that are really strong and some parts not so much. So it's like if you're a runner, but you never weightlift, you've got mad legs, but maybe your arms aren't so strong. That's kind of what's going with our brains. And a lot of this has to do with how we choose to use them. Before I go too deep, let me explain the history of this. You know, back in the 50s and the 40s, the divorce rate was super low, right? Today, it's 50% plus. But back then, it was something like 2 in 1,000, which is really low. And along came television. And I'm not saying that television's bad, by the way. Like, the message here is not screens are bad. The message here is going to be more like, let's think about how we use our brains. What muscles are we exercising? In the same way that we want our upper body and lower body to be balanced, we want the different parts of our brain to be balanced. And that's going to make a huge difference in A, whether we fight, B, when we disagree, what kind of energy and emotion we bring to it, and C, whether we can find the door to joy and prosperity in our marriages. And after all, isn't that what this is about? Joy and prosperity in our marriages? My light cut out for some reason, but we're just going to keep rolling. All right. So what actually happened with the advent of television? It was awesome, right? We had this, we could have entertainment in our homes. We didn't have to go to the theater. We didn't have to go out to a show. We didn't necessarily have to actively read. We could just kick back and relax, and it would be fed to us. And the first thing that advertisers figured out was that when we're in that state of taking in and actively imagining that and being engaged with whatever it is we're watching, the first thing they figured out is that our unconscious mind, which is 80 or 90% of who we are, is very suggestible in that state. And there was a huge amount of research going on in the realm of psychology at the time, and still is, by the way. That's been ongoing, as well as research into how the brain works. And what advertisers figured out really quickly was not only were we suggestible, but that since what we were looking for was excitation and stimulation, if they could play on that, we would buy more. And so all the messages started to become about excitement, about things that really stimulated the parts of our brain that created basically dopamine. It created the chemistry that is joy, that is happiness, that is fun, right? So all the advertisement and the episodes on television all became about this. And we liked it, right? I mean, who doesn't like to feel good when you're watching something and you feel a spike of adrenaline or a spike of dopamine? You're like, this is great, right? And we enjoyed it. But what we didn't realize, or maybe what we didn't own, was that we were allowing ourselves to be manipulated. And many ads are measured, their true success is measured by how much product they sell. All right. So television comes on the scene. Television becomes fairly widespread. And by the 1960s, 1970s, there were studies coming out that showed that families with a television in the living room experienced a significant decrease in direct conversation and engagement with each other. Right. On the other end, there are studies that show that families that eat together develop social skills and the kids are less likely to drink, et cetera. So with television in the living room, there was a whole breakdown of the family thread and not a lot of consciousness about it. Now, there were studies coming out, being released to the public. We were all being told that this was going on. It was all relatively transparent, but we weren't doing anything about it. Why? Because, well, we liked it. By the 1970s, the divorce rate has gone up pretty radically. So there's a direct correlation between cerebral stimulation, brain stimulation via screens, reduction in conversation at home, and increase in the divorce rate. Now, a lot of people argue that the divorce rate was really raised by the fact that most states went to no-fault divorce. It was increased by women pushing for equality. And I won't deny those things, but think about it this way. There's all these social changes going on in the background in our society. So women are pushing men in their relationships at home. And instead of having a conversation about it, they're becoming more and more triggered. What we became as screens evolved and grew is we became creatures of habit. We habitually turned to screens so that we could numb ourselves, so that we could stimulate ourselves, so that we could have whatever feeling it was that we wanted to have. And what that resulted in is that when confronted with human interaction, we were not as well equipped. But what really came out of that was the increase in what's now called the amygdala hijack. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute. All right, so here's what you need to get. 1980s happen and the internet starts to sprout. Now, the internet promised connection. It promised learning. It promised freedom of speech. And now you can look at it now and you can see where we are with that. We have freedom of speech, but we have everyone claiming that they're right, even if they disagree. Everyone claiming that they have science behind them, even if they disagree. Everyone reaching out for validation of what they say being right. When they don't get it, they say that the other side is twisting the facts. There's so much information out there that nobody really knows what the truth is anymore. And we've discredited science as a viable institution for finding truth. But you can count on science in this regard right here, how our brain works, because there's no politicization of that. So let's talk about it more. Now, when we go to social media, it is no secret that what we're looking for is the good life. It's no secret that what we're looking for is stimulation. In fact, the studies show that we go to social media and there is a direct hit of good juices that happens when we watch. When we buy online, we feel good. When we watch online, we feel good. There are studies of pornography addiction, for example, that show that people who have pornography addiction, they feel bad about something, they turn on their phone, look at some pornography, and they get an instant chemical hit. I mean, it's almost better than taking drugs, because instead of taking the drugs, they're stimulating production in their own body. But the problem is that the only way they can get that hit after a while is to go back to the source. And that example of pornography is true for pretty much all of our experience with social media, but more watered down. And what's happened is parts of our brain have grown and developed, the emotional parts, the parts that are stimulated, the parts that are stimulated by violence and by sex specifically have grown. And parts of our brains have diminished, which is our rational thinking mind, the part of our mind that is developed for human interaction, because we've got less of it. And it's worse than that. We have a need to be social. And we've replaced a lot of our social interactions with internet interactions, which simulate social interactions, but are not quite the same. It's not the same when what you're doing is texting. It's not the same when what you're doing is exchanging videos as when you're having direct conversation. All right, so let's talk more about the parts of our brain that are being triggered. A fight that most couples have over and over is what we like to call an amygdala hijack. The amygdala is the part of the brain that looks for fight, flight, or play dead. And when we watch screen time, if we're watching scary movies or violent movies, our amygdala in particular is activated, and we get an adrenaline hit off of our amygdala. Our amygdala is growing and developing with our use of screen time. Our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that decides what we're going to do with information, with emotional stimulation, with social situations, is weaker. So think of our amygdala as being the legs on the runner and our prefrontal cortex being the arms. It's not that we don't use our prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex all the time is deciding what we're going to pay attention to, what situations there are. But think about how I'll just share my own personal experience. I have this podcast I have up on YouTube, and periodically I need to go check to see what we've done and what we're going to do. But inevitably, the first thing I see on my YouTube screen is all the other feeds that I subscribe to. And I start reading them and I forget why I was there. And every time that happens, my prefrontal cortex, A, is distracted. B, there's less energy or less focus available for my prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, like any muscle, will only do the job so many times. So every time I get distracted by, oh, what's on my feed, and forget to actually look at the videos in the podcast to make sure that everything's being posted correctly, my prefrontal cortex is weakened and my ability to focus is lessened. That's basically what's happening when you get into a fight with your partner. Your prefrontal cortex has been easily distracted again and again and again by screen time, and your amygdala has become this super powerful muscle that is highly reactive. And when the amygdala is in better shape than the prefrontal cortex, it overwhelms it every time. And this is why when the fight comes up, you don't just say, honey, let's talk about this later. You say, what? You said what? Or maybe you stuff it down, and stuff it down until it becomes explosive, which is what a lot of people do. There are a lot of ways to do this, and they all involve building up our prefrontal cortex. And this series that we're doing, which this is the kickoff for, is all about why is it that we're so freaking distracted? Why is it that the parts of our brain that we need the most are atrophying? Why is it that the parts of our brain that are least important when it comes to our marriage, at least, are all pumped up and ready to go? And how can we change it? But get that we grew up with screens. All of us who's watching this, we all grew up with screens. Some of us grew up with television. Some of us grew up with social media. We all grew up with screens. And no one told us what to do about it. And just as further evidence as to how social media has hijacked our limbic system is what decides whether we're going to be stimulated positively or stimulated negatively. The limbic system's all about stimulation. Just as more evidence, remember that in Silicon Valley, those families don't let their kids have phones until they're like much older and more developed, because they who design all the apps and all the software and all the things that make screens work understand the highly addictive nature of social media. And they don't want their kids on it. They want their kids focused on school. They want their kids focused on life. They want their kids focused on talking. Now, we know this. You've heard this. I'm not telling you anything you haven't heard, I'm sure. If you've heard this for the first time, I'd be surprised. This is pretty much common knowledge. And yet, we all give our kids phones from age 10 because we have to reach them. And we all walk around with smartphones, totally hooked on what's going on, what's next, easily being distracted. Even now, I just looked at my phone and something popped up on it, and for a second I went somewhere else. And every time we're distracted and go somewhere else, it takes away energy from what we're doing, and it activates parts of our brain that maybe are not so helpful in the moment. We all know this and we still allow it. We still permit it. Just in the same way that I just looked at that phone when I was using it as an illustration. Basically, since the 1990s, when internet usage became widespread, divorce rates have significantly increased, correlating with the rise in digital distractions. From the 1980s, with the advent of television, divorce went from like 2 out of 1,000 to like 5 out of 1,000. And now we're at 500 out of 1,000, right? And that in itself is evidence that with the rise of screens and screen time and the lack of education about how to exercise our minds so that we handle it well, the divorce rate has gone up because our brains, our amygdalas, our limbic systems taking over, and our prefrontal cortex, which is rational, is not. So we have responsibility in that we've been told about those folks at Silicon Valley. We have responsibility in that we know that advertising is geared to make us buy. We have responsibility, and we've chosen to look the other way. But we don't have responsibility because nobody's come out and said what I'm telling you right now, which is the way you use your screens and how you choose to exercise parts of your mind or not will make the difference between whether you have a happy marriage or not. And that's going to make the difference between whether you have a happy family or not. And that's going to make the difference between whether your kids are traumatized massively or minorly. And that's going to make the difference between whether you feel happy and fulfilled. That's going to make the difference between whether your partner and you have joy and prosperity. And so I'm here to tell you, it is time to take back authority over our lives. The hidden cost of living digitally is dissonance, of avoiding a fight and leading parallel lives, feeling like you're living with a roommate, waking up and looking over and going, who's that? How did I end up with this person? It might be lowered physical intimacy. It might be spending money senselessly and having fights about money. It might be infidelity. It might be lack of communication and emotional withdrawal. Studies suggest that couples who regularly disengage from each other in favor of technology are more likely to feel lonely, misunderstood, and eventually pursue separation. Right? So just take a look at how are you using your technology? Are you watching it together? Or are you watching it apart? All right, so let's wrap this up. The evolution of home entertainment, basically screens, from television to what we have now, this mass spread where we're all walking around with screens in our freaking hip pockets, has shifted the focus away from direct communication. It's increased emotional reactivity, and it's made conflict resolution more difficult. Why? Because the part of our brain that actually finds its way through conflict in a way that's healthy, the prefrontal cortex, has become weak, and because we have forgotten how to exercise it. Overstimulation of the amygdala has led to the amygdala being dominant, to us being more willing to fight, to polarization within our marriage. And look at the freaking society. Look at the polarization in society. Look at our politics. What do you think all that polarization is about? What do you think it used to be that two sides who disagreed could find a way through? Today, it seems to be much more of a challenge. That all has to do with the dominance of the amygdala and the shrinking of the prefrontal cortex and the constant stimulation and bombardment by social media. So I'm encouraging you, just for this episode, the call to action is take a look at how you use your technology. Just take a look at it. And if you're looking for tools to help you in your communication, go to our website, richinrelationship.com. In the next episode, we're going to talk about emotional triggers and how past experiences amplify today's conflicts. So stay tuned as we go deep into why you can't seem to stop fighting and how you can find your way back to joy and prosperity.